everybody. So this video is called Why Fascism and Being a Nazi is Bad for You and Not Just Them. And on some level, I'm kind of baffled that I have to do this. On another level, it makes sense because we've been told Nazism and fascism is bad to such an extent that we've never had to think about it. We've never had to follow through on the political philosophies behind all of this. I'm not trying to persuade anyone of anything. I'm trying to articulate the philosophies behind it so that you can express yourself and see which parts you agree with and which parts you don't. Here's the short version. Here's the TLDR. Fascism is the opposite of freedom. You will not be free, and while people are often willing to give up freedom for safety, you won't be safe either. Even if you are part of the preferred group, if you're not Jewish or gay or an immigrant or what have you, even if you are a straight white Christian with money, you will not be safe or free. That's the bottom line, and that's what I'm going to articulate and why. The word fascism was coined by Mussolini and applies specifically to the Italian system, although the Nazis were fascists too. Fascism comes from a Roman idea of a bunch of twigs tied together. But really, it's a symbol throughout history that has meant different things that Mussolini used for his own tools. Nazi stands for National Socialists. But the Nazis weren't socialists in the way that Marx envisioned or the way that we talk about when we talk about Sweden and Denmark and places like that. They were fascists. And it's useful to talk about fascism in general before we talk about Nazism specifically. The government or the leader says something that isn't true and then manipulates society using their powers, using their followers to make it true. So, for example, they may say that undocumented immigrants are all criminals and the locus of tremendous violent crime. And then they create a police force that arrests all of them and accuses them and then says, look, they're in prison. Look, they're all accused. What I said was true. And the whole journey of the initial fascist society is to make that happen. The next thing that happens is that nationalism becomes a religion. In a fascist society, everyone serves the state. The state and the leader of the state is that which needs to be worshipped. And it replaces all of the other identities that people have because all they become is a citizen in this state. So it doesn't matter if you see yourself as Italian or French or Japanese. Doesn't matter if you see yourself as white or black or Christian or Jewish. All of that disappears. What you are is a citizen of the state. All people are tools. In a democracy, people are individuals. They get to choose their own goals. They get to choose their own path. They get to decide what's important to them and what's not. In a fascist society, all of that is decided by the leadership, by the authoritarian government. And you become a tool, everyone becomes a tool, subservient to that and indistinguishable from another. So you can kill someone and replace them with someone else or move people around. It doesn't matter. They're all identical. Everyone is in service of the same nationalistic religion. There's no private sphere. Everything is public. Everything is political. And every single thing you do is the government's decision. Who you love, what books you read, again, what religion you find yourself a part of, what television show to watch, what to write in your diary is all controlled by and overseen by the government. Because again, individuality disappears in service of worship of the state and in reality, the leader. Because nationalist identity replaces religion, the leader replaces religion. So you may be a Christian who worships Jesus. Jesus is going to be replaced by the leader of the state. And you get to decide for yourself whether Donald Trump is a fascist. But let's look at these images to see the way that Trump is already replacing Jesus. The way that that symbolism is eradicating Christianity, even though a lot of people who support him identify themselves as Christian nationalists. The Christianity of that is going to disappear, and all it's going to be is nationalism. That's really dangerous because often the leader is overthrown, but even if not, the leader is going to die eventually. And again, if you imagine Donald Trump as that leader, you got to keep in mind that he's not going to be around for that long, and that he's going to be replaced by J.D. Vance, by Marco Rubio, by someone else. Remember those images that I showed of Donald Trump being crucified? How do you feel about that being Marco Rubio on the cross? How do you feel about giving your fealty to the replacement of the fascist leader? Because that's what fascism does. It puts all authority and all glory in the person who is the personification of the society, the personification of the state. In a fascist society, government is top-down, not bottom-up. So it doesn't matter what you think, and it doesn't matter how many people protest, and it doesn't matter what people vote for. Decisions are made from the top down. And those decisions are in service of whatever ideology, whatever beliefs the leader has. This also means that there's no upward mobility in a fascist state. Things don't get better, they only get worse. No one is going to get richer under a fascist state. No one is going to get higher salaries under a fascist state. Everyone is going to be stuck in the life that they are in when the fascist state comes to fruition, and then little by little, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. This is why everyone suffers under fascism, because except for the tiny little elite of people, everyone else sacrifices everything for the state. And what this means is that once the fascist state is complete, it's worse for everyone. Now, there are other things. For example, the fascist state glorifies war and condemns peace and sacrifices all of the young people to that. It has a very masculine vision of what power is. Doesn't care, it only competes. That's fascism. Nazism is an instantiation of that. Nazism builds on all of that and adds particular difference, right? So if you look at the Nazi regime, there was no freedom of speech or freedom of the press. There was no freedom of art. Art was labeled degenerate and banned. So people couldn't express themselves. They couldn't experiment. They couldn't have interesting television. They couldn't have new music. Everything was controlled by the vision of what was good and pure and condemned by the vision of what's dirty. They abolished trade unions and workers' rights, and that gave employers absolute power. There was no way to fight a bad decision in your job. There was no way to complain to HR. Whatever your boss said goes. You no longer have neighbors under Nazism. Everyone's an informant. You don't have neighborhoods. You don't have communities. Everything is constant surveillance. And so your neighbors were always watching and reporting other people for doing the wrong thing. Disobedience at your workplace, disobedience in your home, disobedience with the drapes closed, all of that was subject to informants and subject to being reported and punished. And you didn't get to choose where to work anyway. The economy was all messed up under Nazism. At first, there was tons of employment and everyone got jobs. But the economy collapsed and those jobs weren't worth very much, and people got moved around and shifted, and a lot of people ended up being unemployed. There were 12 million forced laborers under the Nazi regime. 12 million people who were in camps, in factories, in prisons, who were doing the so-called work of the Third Reich. A lot of the companies that we know and love, Siemens, BMW, Volkswagen, they really only exist because they didn't have any labor costs during the Third Reich. They got rich off of labor. Now, you may think I'm not going to be one of those people. I'm not going to be a political prisoner. I'm not going to be a minority, blah, blah, blah. But the state, even if you weren't forced to work under Nazism, you were forced to do other things. 80% of men 20 to 30 years old were drafted. 80% were sent to war. The people who weren't in camps and the people who weren't drafted had to devote their time to supporting the Nazi Party. They had to go to rallies. They had to go to Bund meetings. They had to do all sorts of things. So your time is not your own. Your identity is not your own. All the money was spent on war. So even though, as I said initially, there was tremendously high employment, all the money went to fighting. And by the end of the war, there was scarcity, there was starvation, there was rationing. All of that stuff is an indication of what I said before, that under a fascist regime, your life only gets worse. It doesn't get better. Life became unbearable during the war under Nazi Germany, from hunger to bombings. And then when the Nazis fell, when Hitler killed himself and the Allies came in, things got worse. Because not only was there starvation and horrendous economic conditions, the country was quote unquote invaded. Cities like Berlin, cities like Vienna in Austria were taken over by the other countries, and they were divided up by, there was the French quarter, there was the Russian quarter, there was the American quarter. Your country is no longer your own. You are now subject to the punishment of the people who took over the fascist society because the fascist society collapsed. Now, notice at no point did I talk about the murder of Jews or Jehovah's Witnesses or Roma or the disabled or gays and lesbians. I mentioned political prisoners in passing. All I did was describe the experience of the everyday German. Because if I can't convince you that genocide is wrong, if I can't convince you that Nazism and fascism is just evil on its face, then I'm not going to be able to do that by giving you statistics about concentration camps. Here's what I'll conclude. Under a fascist regime, whether it models itself on Nazis or not, being white will only protect you for a short time. Being Christian will only protect you for a short time. Being straight, male, wealthy will only protect you for a short time. Fascism is the circumstance in which all individuality disappears and all activities are in service of the state and the leader. And that's not good for anyone.